You know, Joy was murdered on the 28th of July, 1993.
It's a quiet summer morning in 1993. The streets of North London are still asleep. The sky is a dull grey, the air thick, with the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. In a small apartment on Crouch Hill, a 40-year-old woman named Joy Gardner is making breakfast for her 5-year-old son. She's humming a song she wrote, a reggae melody about hope and home. Joy is a mother, a singer, a daughter of Jamaica who moved to England over a decade earlier, chasing a dream. But in just a few minutes, the dream will shatter. At 5 a.m., the knock comes. The sharp, insistent pounding of authority. Joy freezes. She knows what this means. For weeks, she'd lived in fear of this moment, the looming threat of deportation after overstaying her visa. The UK's immigration policies in the 1990s were unforgiving, part of what politicians called a hostile environment designed to deter outsiders. But Joy wasn't a criminal. She was a human being, a woman who paid her taxes, who sang in her local church choir, who tucked her son into bed every night. And now, none of that mattered. The door explodes inward. 5 officers from the Metropolitan Police Alien Deportation Group storm into her home. They're armed with more than just badges and warrants. They carry a 13-foot restraint belt, handcuffs, and a gag. Tools meant for violent criminals, not unarmed mothers. Joy panics. She begs them to stop, to think of her child. But what happens next isn't an arrest, it's a slaughter. They wrap the restraint belt around her head 13 times. They shackle her wrists, bind her ankles, and stuff a gag so deep into her mouth that it crushes her tongue. For 10 minutes, Joy Gardner is pinned to the floor, her body thrashing as her brain screams for oxygen. By the time the officers step back, she's unconscious. 4 days later, she's declared brain dead. The coroner will call it a misadventure. The courts will call it justified. But her family, her son who witnessed it all, will call it murder. Joy Gardner's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was a flashpoint, a moment that ripped open the facade of British justice to expose the wrath beneath. In the 1990s, dark British citizens were 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white ones. The same decade saw the infamous Macpherson Report label the Met Police as institutionally racist. Joy's case became a rallying cry, a symbol of how easily protocol can become a license for brutality and how often that brutality targets people of color. But this isn't just a story about the past. The same tactics used on Joy, restraint, suffocation, dehumanization, echo in the killings of George Floyd, Eric Garner, and Sheku Bayoch. The same systems that failed Joy in 1993 are failing marginalized communities today. And the same questions linger. Who gets to be seen as human? And who gets to be protected? Today, we'll dissect Joy Gardner's case piece by piece. We'll confront the officers who walked free. We'll unpack the policies that armed them. And we will ask, what has really changed in 30 years? Because Joy's story isn't just a chapter in history, it is a warning, a demand, a mother's silent scream that still haunts us all. To understand Joy Gardner's death, we must first step back into the Britain of the 1980s and the 1990s, a nation grappling with identity, fear, and a rising tide of xenophobia. This was the era of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, a time when the phrase hostile environment wasn't yet a scandalous headline, but an official policy. A calculated strategy to make life so unbearable for undocumented immigrants that they would choose to leave. But who were these so-called illegal people? Many, like Joy, were from the former British colonies in the Caribbean. They were the Windrush generation and their families, invited to the UK decades earlier to rebuild the country after World War II, only to be labeled aliens when their labor was no longer convenient. The government's tactics were relentless. Raids on homes and workplaces, random stops demanding papers, please, a media machine that painted black and brown immigrants as criminals, spongers, threats to British values. Newspapers ran headlines like "Swamped" and "Bogus asylum seekers," stoking public panic. Politicians doubled down, passing laws like the 1971 Immigration Act, which retroactively stripped rights from Commonwealth citizens. For families like Joy's, it was a betrayal. They paid taxes, contributed to communities, raised children who knew no other home, and now they were treated like invaders. Joy Gardner arrived in London from Jamaica in 1987. She was 34 years old, a talented singer with a voice that could fill a room. She'd left her young daughter behind temporarily, hoping to secure stability before bringing her to the UK. Life wasn't easy. She worked odd jobs, navigated a labyrinth of visa extensions, and faced the daily microaggressions of racism. But Joy was resilient. She found solace in music, joining a local reggae band and performing at community centers. By 1993, she'd remarried, given birth to a son, and was fighting to stay in the country she'd call home. But the hostile environment had no room for her humanity. When her visa expired, Joy became a target. The Home Office flagged her for deportation, and the machinery of the state began to turn. Letters threatening arrest, surveillance, the constant dread that today could be the day they come for her. This was the reality for thousands of Black Britons, a reality policed by units like the Met's Alien Deportation Group, whose very name reduced human beings to extraterrestrial threats. The group's tactics were militarized long before the term SWAT team entered the public lexicon. Officers trained in brutal restraint techniques, equipment designed to humiliate, 14-foot body belts, leather gags, canvas hoods, and their targets, not violent offenders, but grandmothers, students, mothers like Joy. The logic was perverse. If you make an example of the vulnerable, others will fall in line. And yet, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Grassroots organizations like the Black Families Immigration Consultancy and the Brixton Black Women's Group fought back, offering legal aid and shelter to those hunted by the state. They documented abuses, protested outside detention centers, and shouted truths the media ignored. But in 1993, their warnings were drowned out by the roar of institutional power. Joy's story is not just one woman's tragedy. It's a snapshot of a system weaponized against the marginalized, a system where immigration officers worked hand in glove with police, where the courts turned a blind eye to violence and where the press amplified dehumanization. This was a tinderbox awaiting a spark. And on July 28, 1993, the spark ignited. July 28, 1993, 4:55 a.m. A blue police van rolls through the empty streets of North London. Inside are 5 officers from the Metropolitan Police Alien Deportation Group, a unit tasked with enforcing the UK's draconian immigration laws. They are armed with a warrant, a battering ram, and a 14-foot restraint belt, a device more commonly used on wild animals than human beings. Their target? Apartment 5 on Crouch Hill, where Joy Gardner sleeps, beside her 5-year-old son. The officers have done this before. They know the drill. Arrive before dawn, when targets are disorientated. Use force first, questions later. But Joy's case is different. She isn't a fugitive. She isn't hiding. And her crime? Overstaying a visa by mere months. A bureaucratic error, not a violent act. Yet tonight, she'll be treated like a threat to national security. At 5 a.m., the knocking begins. 3 sharp raps. Joy stirs, her heart racing. She knows who it is. For weeks, she'd received letters from the Home Office warning of deportation. She'd sought legal help, pleaded for more time, to not avail. Now, the moment she feared has arrived. She scrambles to the door, her son clinging to her nightgown. Please, she begs through the wood, let me wake my son properly. Don't scare him. The officers don't respond. Instead, they raise the battering ram. What happens next unfolds in seconds. The door explodes inward, splinters flying. Her son screams as his mother is thrown backward by the impact. 5 officers surge into the tiny flat, their boots stomping over toys and family photos. Joy, barefoot and wearing only a nightdress, is cornered in her own kitchen. You're being detained under the Immigration Act, one officer barks. No explanation, no empathy. Joy panics. She reaches for her son, but an officer blocks her path. Her son watches, paralyzed as his mother, a woman who'd soothed his nightmares just hours earlier, is slammed against the wall. 2 officers grab her arms, twisting them behind her back. A third yanks her hair, forcing her head down. But Joy fights, not with violence, but with the raw, primal instinct of a mother refusing to be torn from her child. This resistance, witnesses later say, is all the justification the officers need. One officer pulls the 14-foot restraint belt from a kit bag. The device, a brutal relic of Britain's colonial past, is a canvas strap lined with metal eyelets designed to immobilize prisoners during transport. But tonight, it won't be used on Joy's body. It will be used on her head. They loop the belt around her skull once, twice, 13 times. With each pass, the canvas tightens, crushing her face. Joy's screams turn into gurgles as another officer forces a leather gag into her mouth, stuffing it so deep it fractures her teeth. Her ankles are cuffed, her wrist shackled. Within minutes, she's trussed like livestock, her body convulsing as oxygen deprivation sets in. All while her son watches, sobbing, as his mother is pinned face down on the carpet. One officer kneels on her back, his full weight compressing her lungs. Another checks his watch. 10 minutes pass. 20. Joy's thrashing slows. Then it stops. When the officers finally roll her over, her lips are blue. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stare at the ceiling. Panic sets in. They rip off the gag, perform half-hearted CPR, and call an ambulance. But it's too late. Joy Gardner never regained consciousness. 4 days later, on August 1st, 1993, she is declared brain dead. And the cause of death? Positional asphyxia, a clinical term for suffocation by restraint. The pathologist's report notes bruising so severe it suggests a knee pressed into her back with considerable force. Her larynx is crushed. Her tongue, swollen and bloody, bears the imprint of the gag. But the officers involved tell a different story. At the inquest, they claim Joy violently resisted, alleging she bit one of them and grabbed an officer's genitals. They insist the restraint was by the book, approved by superiors. The media amplifies their narrative with headlines like "Deadly Bite" and "Cop Attacked by Deportee." But the evidence tells another truth. Neighbors who witnessed the raid describe no violence from Joy, only terror. Forensic experts later confirmed the officer's account of a struggle is animatically impossible given how quickly the restraint would have rendered her unconscious. Even the bite marks are debunked. Joy's dental records prove her teeth never made contact with flesh. The most damning detail, though, is what happens after Joy is subdued. Instead of calling an ambulance immediately, the officers spend 20 minutes filling out paperwork in her apartment. They make tea, they joke about overtime pay, all while Joy Gardner lies dying on the floor. This is the unvarnished truth of July 28, 1993, a truth buried beneath lies, victim blaming, and institutional cowardice. A truth that forces us to ask, was this a tragic mistake or a chilling glimpse of how the state treats those it deems disposable? Joy's son, now in his 30s, still remembers the sound of the battering ram. The sight of his mother's body, limp and broken. The officers telling him to stop crying as they carried her away. His trauma is a living testament of the human cost of policies crafted in wood-paneled offices, far from the blood-stained carpets of Crouch Hill. But this incident isn't just about one morning. It's about the systems that made it inevitable, the training that taught those officers to see Joy as less than humans, the laws that rewarded brutality, the silence of a society that looked away. In the wake of Joy Gardner's death, the British legal system swung into motion, not to deliver justice, but to protect its own. The first test came in 1995, 2 years after her killing, with the coroner's inquest. A process meant to determine the how and the why of her death became a masterclass in evasion. The coroner, Sir Montague Lavine, presided over a jury of 7 white men and 1 white woman. Joy's family sat in the gallery, forced to listen as the officers who restrained her were framed as heroes. The pathologist's report was clear. Joy died from positional asphyxia caused by excessive restraint. Her brain had been starved of oxygen for over 10 minutes. Yet, the officer's testimony painted her as the aggressor. They claimed she kicked like a mule, bit like a dog, and threatened to kill them. One officer even alleged she grabbed his testicles, a claim met with smirks from the defense team, but the physical evidence told a different story. No officer sustained injuries beyond superficial scratches. Joy's autopsy revealed no defensive wounds. Her hands, bound behind her back, never touched them. The coroner's instructions to the jury were riddled with bias. He reminded them that the police have a difficult job and urged them to consider whether Joy's state of mind contributed to her death. After just hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of misadventure, a term implying her death was a tragic accident, a risk inherent to resisting arrest. Joy's mother, Myrna Simpson, stormed out of the courtroom shouting, "They murdered my daughter. How dare they call it an accident?" But the real farce began in September 1995, when three officers, Inspector Colin Smith, Sergeant Christopher Alder, and Constable Paul Harrison, stood trial for manslaughter. The prosecution's case was hobbled from the start. Key evidence, like the 14-foot restraint belt, mysteriously disappeared before the trial. Witnesses who lived in the building were never called to testify, and the judge, Justice Ian Kennedy, allowed the defense to portray Joy as a large, aggressive woman, a racist trope weaponized to justify her dehumanization. The defense strategy was simple: blame the victim. They claimed Joy's superhuman strength forced the officers to restrain her with necessary force. A so-called expert testified that black people have higher pain thresholds, a pseudoscientific lie rooted in colonial-era medical racism. The jury, overwhelmingly white and middle-class, absorbed every word. On October 20, 1995, after a 6-week trial, the officers were acquitted. The courtroom erupted. Joy's husband, Andrew, screamed, "No justice, no peace," as Joy's son, now 7 years old, clutched his grandmother's hand. Outside, protesters clashed with police. Chants of "Remember Joy Gardner" echoed down the Strand. But the headlines next morning focused not on the outrage but on the officers' relief. "We are innocent," blared the Sun, alongside a photo of Smith smiling outside the courtroom. The public response was volcanic. Black communities, long accustomed to systematic betrayal, mobilized. Joy's face appeared on protest banners alongside Stephen Lawrence, a black teenager murdered in a racist attack just 2 years earlier. Activists occupied police stations, staged die-ins at the Home Office, and plastered central London with posters demanding, "Who killed Joy Gardner?" The case became a flashpoint in the growing movement against police brutality, a movement that crossed oceans, linking hands with struggles in the US, South Africa, and beyond. The media, however, remained split. While progressive outlets like The Guardian condemned the trial as whitewash, tabloids doubled down on demonizing Joy. The Daily Mail ran an op-ed titled, "The real victim here is the rule of law," arguing that criticizing police endangers us all. Even politicians joined the fray. Home Secretary Michael Howard, architect of the hostile environment, praised the officers' professionalism and warned against rushing to judgment, a phrase that would echo for decades in cases of state violence. But the most damning indictment came from within the system itself. In 1999, the Macpherson Report, launched after the bungled investigation into Stephen Lawrence's murder, declared the Met Police institutionally racist. Among the evidence cited, the handling of Joy Gardner's case. The report noted a pattern of excessive force during deportations and condemned the culture of impunity that shielded abusive officers. Yet, no reforms were made to the alien deportation group. No policies changed. The restraint belt, though quietly phased out, was replaced by tasers and spit hoods, tools just as deadly in the wrong hands. Joy's family refused to let her death be forgotten. Myrna Simpson, armed with nothing but a mother's grief, became a vocal critic of police brutality. She toured the country, speaking at universities and community centers, her voice trembling but unyielding.
We just want justice. That's what we want. We don't want our young people to die.
They killed my daughter because she was black, she'd say, because they knew they could get away with it. Her activism forced Joy's name back into headlines, but the legal doors remained shut. In 2003, the European Court of Human Rights refused to hear the case, citing insufficient evidence. Yet, the seeds of change were planted. Joy's case became a reference point in every subsequent debate about police accountability. When London erupted in protests after the 2011 killing of Mark Dugan, a black man shot by Met officers, activists invoked her name. When the Windrush Scandal broke in 2018, exposing how the UK had illegally detained and deported black British citizens, commentators drew direct lines back to the hostile environment of the 1990s. Joy Gardner's death was no longer just a tragedy, it was proof of a system built to destroy. But what does justice look like 30 years later? The officers involved never faced consequences. Colin Smith retired on a full pension. Christopher Alder was promoted to training new recruits. And Paul Harrison? He left the force and now runs a security consultancy. Meanwhile, Joy Gardner's son still suffers from PTSD. "I don't just miss my mom," he told a reporter in 2020. "I miss the person I could have been if they hadn't taken her from me." The legal proceedings did more than fail Joy Gardner. They revealed the truth many still deny, that the law is not blind. It sees colors, it sees class, it sees power. And too often it looks away. Joy Gardner's death was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a disease rotting the core of British policing, a disease called institutional racism. To call it a few bad apples would be a lie. It was an orchid, poisoned from the roots up. The term institutional racism entered the public lexicon in 1999 with the Macpherson Report, a damning inquiry into the Met's botched investigation of Stephen Lawrence's murder. Sir William Macpherson's conclusion was unequivocal. The police force was riddled with collective failure to protect black lives, a culture of prejudice and ignorance. But what Macpherson's outlined was not new. Black Britons had lived this truth for decades. Joy Gardner's case, buried just 6 years earlier, was proof. Let's dissect the anatomy of this systematic rot. First, the policies. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Met's alien deportation group operated under guidelines that normalized brutality. Officers were trained to view immigrants, particularly black immigrants, as inherently dangerous. Restraint techniques meant for violent offenders were used on grandmothers, students, and mothers like Joy. The 14-foot belt, the gag, the hood, these were not improvised tools. They were sanctioned. A 1994 internal memo even praised the efficiency of the restraint belt, despite multiple complaints of injury. Then, the data. In 1993, the year Joy died, black people were 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people in London. By 2023, the disparity had widened to 9 times. Think about that. In 30 years, the racism quantifiably worsened. Deaths in police custody tell a similar story. Between 1990 and 2023, over 2,000 people died in police custody or following contact with UK police. Not a single officer was convicted. Not one. But statistics alone can capture the human toll. Meet Sean Rigg, a 40-year-old black musician experiencing a mental health crisis in 2008. Police restrained him in a prone position for 8 minutes in the back of a van. He died of cardiac arrest. And like Joy, the officers claimed he violently resisted. Like Joy, the inquest ruled his death accidental. Or Christopher Alder, an ex-soldier left to die on a police station floor in 1998 while officers mocked his dying gasps. His sister later said, "They treated him like a dog." These cases aren't coincidences. They are patterns, and the patterns traces back to colonialism. The same mentality that justified shackling enslaved Africans on plantations evolved into the SOS laws of the 1970s, which targeted black youth, and into today's gang matrices, a racist database that criminalizes black boys for wearing hoodies or listening to drill music. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. The Macpherson Report promised reform, but what it actually changed? The alien deportation group was quietly rebranded as immigration enforcement. Restraint belts were replaced by tasers, used disproportionately on black people. In 2023, the Met's own data revealed that 75% of taser discharges in London targeted black or minority ethnic individuals. Meanwhile, the Windrush Scandal exposed how the UK government illegally detained and deported black citizens, people with every right to be here, while politicians again stoked fear about illegal immigrants. Community trust has evaporated. In 2022 survey, 85% of black Britons said they believed the police were institutionally racist. This is the legacy of Joy Gardner's death, a multi-generational trauma, a festering wound. And yet, the Met continues to gaslight the public. In 2023, Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley refused to admit institutional racism, calling the term too political. Meanwhile, the force remains 92% white in a city where 46% of residents are non-white. But resistance persists. Organizations like Inquest, which tracks death in custody, and the United Families and Friends campaign, led by grieving relatives, fight for transparency. Artists like Stormzy and Akala weave Joy's story into lyrics, ensuring new generations remember her name. And in 2020, when Black Lives Matter protests ignited globally, London's streets echoed with chants of "No justice, no peace." A direct descendant of the outrage that followed Joy's killing. The question isn't whether policing is racist. The evidence screams yes. The question is, how many more Joys must die before we dismantle the system? How many more inquests, reports, and empty promises will it take? Joy Gardner's case is a mirror, and what it reflects is ugly. A nation that preaches fairness, yet practices brutality. A justice system that protects power instead of people. A society that still hasn't learned the most basic lesson. Black lives matter. Joy Gardner's story is not over. It lingers in the silence that follows a siren. In the quickened pulse of a parent watching their child walk to school. In the way a knock at the door can still make a whole family freeze. Her death forced Britain to stare into the abscess of its own hypocrisy, to see the wrath beneath the veneer of civility. But 30 years later, we must ask, have we learned anything, or are we still choking on the same lies? Let's be clear. The officers who killed Joy Gardner were not rogue actors. They were products of a system that equates the color of one's skin with criminality, that trains its enforcers to see restraint as its first resort, and that rewards brutality with promotions and pensions. A system that acquits killers in uniform while imprisoning those who dare to protest them. Joy's case was never about a few bad apples. It was about a tree. And the tree still stands. But so does the resistance. Joy's name is etched into the DNA of every movement fighting for racial justice. When protesters march against police violence, her spirit walks beside them. When lawyers challenge discriminatory laws, her voice fuels their arguments. When a mother holds her child tighter, wondering if the state will not see their humanity, Joy's story whispers a warning and a promise: you are not alone.